On January 3, 1943, German supply trains destined for the Eastern Front were sitting idle in a Warsaw rail yard. The temperature had dropped to -20 degrees Celsius. Inside the Deutsche Reichsbahn headquarters, railway officials stared at their latest reports with growing alarm. In just the previous month, they had moved 230 trains daily across the border into occupied Soviet territory, 76 through the northern sector, 87 through the center, 67 through the south. Yet it wasn't enough. Not nearly enough. At Stalingrad, 300 kilometers from the nearest functioning railhead, the German Sixth Army was starving. This wasn't supposed to happen. Railways had transformed warfare in the previous century. During the American Civil War, Union forces moved 25,000 troops by rail to reinforce Chattanooga in just 11 days, a feat that would have taken months by foot. In the Franco-Prussian War of 1870, Germany deployed 500,000 men using its superior rail network, crushing France in 6 weeks. By 1914, European powers had built their entire war plans around railway timetables. When Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated in Sarajevo, the mobilization schedules were so rigid that once the trains started rolling toward the fronts, diplomatic solutions became nearly impossible. The trains themselves dictated the tempo of war. But World War II would prove different. This war would be fought across distances that made previous conflicts look like regional skirmishes. The Eastern Front alone stretched nearly 3,000 kilometers from the Baltic to the Black Sea. A single panzer division required up to 300 trains to transport when fully equipped. The Germans would eventually operate over 230 trains daily just crossing into Soviet territory during the peak of their operations. American railroads handled 64% of all intercity freight throughout the war, peaking at 72% in 1943. The Soviet Union would evacuate 1.5 million carloads of freight eastward in just 5 months, moving entire factories, populations, and the machinery of war across a continent under fire. Railways became more than transportation infrastructure. They became strategic weapons, contested as fiercely as any battlefield. Polish resistance conducted around 2,850 railway sabotage operations between 1942 and 1945. Attacking 1,825 large train complements and destroying 380 tracks, 150 bridges, and 210 stations. Entire German divisions were tied down, protecting rail lines from partisan attacks. The Allies dropped thousands of tons of bombs on railway marshalling yards, knowing that crippling the rail network could strangle the German war machine more effectively than destroying factories. The story of World War II cannot be told without understanding the railways. While tanks, aircraft, and naval vessels captured headlines and shaped tactical battles, it was the unglamorous work of locomotives, freight cars, and railway workers that determined which armies could fight and which would starve. The difference between victory and defeat often came down to tonnage delivered, bridges rebuilt, and schedules maintained under impossible conditions. Every offensive, every retreat, every encirclement depended on iron rails and the men and women who kept them running. This is their story. By 1935, Europe's railway map looked like a vast spiderweb of steel, each strand representing decades of investment, engineering ambition, and strategic calculation. Germany's Deutsche Reichsbahn controlled 68,728 kilometers of track, including 30,330 kilometers of main lines and another 27,209 kilometers of branch lines. This wasn't merely transportation infrastructure. This was a weapon system waiting to be activated. The Germans understood railways better than any nation on Earth. They had been building their system with military precision since Otto von Bismarck unified the German states in 1871. After World War I, the Treaty of Versailles had forced Germany to nationalize its railways, ostensibly so the profits could pay war reparations. In 1924, the Deutsche Reichsbahngesellschaft was created as a nominally private company, though the German state owned it completely. Then in 1937, as Hitler's regime prepared for war, full sovereignty over the rail system returned to the Reich. The railway was reorganized once more, this time explicitly under state control. What the Germans had built by the late 1930s was extraordinary. They had developed high-speed diesel trains, the Fliegende or flying trains, that connected Berlin to dozens of German cities at speeds reaching 160 kilometers per hour. The prototype, called the Flying Hamburger, had set records that captured international attention. In 1936, the Henschel-Wegmann steam locomotive achieved 185 kilometers per hour during test runs. These weren't just civilian conveniences. They demonstrated German engineering superiority and, more importantly, the capacity to move large numbers of people and materials across vast distances quickly. The Deutsche Reichsbahn employed standardized designs. Their goods wagons used interchangeable components, introduced around 1927 as the Austauschbauart system. By the 1930s, welded construction replaced riveted cars, and solid wheels replaced spoked wheels on freight wagons. As war approached, production shifted entirely toward Kriegsbauart, wartime designs built for speed of construction and maximum utility. These were the tools that would transport tanks, vehicles, troops, and supplies. The focus was simple: fewer types, greater numbers. But Germany's railway network didn't exist in isolation. It connected to the broader European system, a complex web of incompatible gauges, competing national interests, and border stations that had evolved over nearly a century. By the 1930s, Western European countries like Britain, France, and Germany operated comprehensive networks linking industrial centers with ports and rural areas. Britain, the birthplace of railways, had been laying track since the 1820s. By 1870, both England and Belgium showed the highest railway densities in Europe. Germany and France had followed quickly, and by 1900 the railway network had undergone significant transformation across the continent. Yet Europe was far from unified. Spain, Portugal, and parts of Italy lagged behind with fewer rail connections per square mile than their northern neighbors. The Balkans presented a patchwork. Austria-Hungary had poured resources into railway construction in its territories before World War I, creating relatively dense networks in some regions. The Ottoman Empire, by contrast, had moved glacially. These disparities would matter enormously when war came. The most significant barrier wasn't just density, but gauge. Most of Western Europe used the standard gauge of 1,435 millimeters, the width between rails that had been adopted from British railways in the 1830s. But Russia, and by extension the Soviet Union, used a broad gauge of 1,524 millimeters, later standardized to 1,520 millimeters. This difference, seemingly minor at just 85 millimeters, created an unbridgeable gap. Trains built for one gauge couldn't run on tracks built for another. Every piece of cargo moving between Western Europe and Russia had to be unloaded and transferred at the border. Poland sat directly in the middle of this divide. Before World War I, Poland didn't exist as an independent state. Its territory had been carved up between the German, Austro-Hungarian, and Russian empires. When Poland was reborn in 1918 after the Treaty of Versailles, it inherited three completely different railway systems. The former Prussian territories in western Poland had dense, well-maintained railways built to standard gauge. The former Russian territories in eastern Poland had broader gauge tracks and far lower railway density. In 1912, railway density in the Polish parts of the three partitioning powers showed stark contrasts. The eastern provinces of Prussia boasted high network density, even by international standards, while Russian Poland lagged far behind. The newly independent Poland faced enormous challenges. By the summer of 1939, the Polish state railways operated an extensive but disjointed network. There were 48 rail border crossings in operation. Passenger trains connected Warsaw to Kaunas twice daily, with one train offering a direct Warsaw-Kaunas coach. But passenger connections between the Soviet Union and Western Europe required changes of train due to the gauge difference. If you traveled toward Moscow, you changed trains at the Soviet border station Niegoreloje. Traveling from Moscow, the change happened at the Polish station Stolpce. Inside Poland, railway connections between major cities worked reasonably well for most routes, but there were glaring gaps. The connection between Wilno and the seaport of Gdynia, roughly 500 kilometers apart as the crow flies, required trains to cover about 900 kilometers because they had to route through Warsaw. Construction of a more direct line had been planned, running from Lapaj through Ostrołęka, Przasnysz, and Mława to connect with the Warsaw-Gdansk line. The war would stop this project before a single rail was laid. Across the Atlantic, the United States had built the world's longest railway network. By 1916, U.S. railroad trackage reached 254,000 miles, the highest in history. American railroads were privately owned, fiercely competitive, and massively profitable during their golden age. By 1930, this network of 250,000 miles accounted for roughly 65% of all freight tonnage carried in the United States and nearly all long-distance passenger transport. The rail system crossed vast distances, connected both coasts, and tied together industrial centers with agricultural regions and natural resource extraction sites. But by the 1930s, American railroads were in trouble. The Great Depression had devastated traffic. Unemployment rose from 1.5 million in late 1929 to 4 million by spring 1930, eventually climbing to nearly 5 million by January 1931. Railroad passenger numbers, which had peaked at roughly 1 billion travelers in 1916, had already declined to 700 million by 1930. By the end of the decade, passenger traffic would fall another 35.7%. The automobile, particularly Henry Ford's Model T introduced in 1908, had begun eating into the passenger market during the 1920s. By 1929, automobiles carried 175 billion passenger miles compared to the railroad's 34 billion. Buses controlled 15% of the commercial passenger market by 1929, a figure that would jump to 38% by 1950. Major railroad systems entered receivership during the 1930s. The Rock Island filed in 1933, the Milwaukee Road and Chicago and Northwestern in 1935, the Erie in 1938, and the New York, New Haven, and Hartford in 1935. Only the strongest railroads survived without bankruptcy. Railroad companies, worn out from World War I nationalization and hampered by restrictive government regulation, struggled to reinvest in infrastructure. Meanwhile, the government poured money into competing transportation systems. Highways, rural roads, airports. The railroads faced unfair competition from modes of transport that received massive public subsidy while they operated under strict federal rate regulations. Yet the American rail network remained formidable. The infrastructure was there. The locomotives, freight cars, and organizational capacity existed, even if underutilized. When war came, this network would prove essential. American industry depended on it. Coal, steel, agricultural products, manufactured goods, all moved primarily by rail. The rails connected ports on both coasts with factories in the interior. They linked the industrial Northeast with the agricultural Midwest and the resource-rich West. To the east, the Soviet Union faced different challenges entirely. The Russian railway system had been devastated by World War I and the subsequent Civil War. When the Soviet government took control in 1922, the railways were in shambles. Locomotives were in poor condition. Tracks needed repair. Rolling stock was inadequate. But the Soviets understood that railways were the lifeblood of their enormous country. They began rebuilding immediately. During the 1920s and 1930s, Soviet transportation, particularly railways, experienced rapid development. By 1925, some 4,000 kilometers of new lines had been laid in both the European and Asian portions of the Soviet Union. The first electrified line, an industrial spur from Baku to Surakani, was completed in 1926. During the first 5-year plan from 1928 to 1932, the railroad network was repaired, improved, and expanded. New rail lines connected eastern regions with industrial areas in the west. The Turkestan-Siberian Railway, 1,450 kilometers long, was completed by 1930 to connect Central Asia's resources with the rest of the Soviet economy. The Central Kazakhstan and Caucasus railroads followed. Soviet rail freight turnover expanded dramatically, from approximately 40 billion ton-kilometers in 1928 to over 200 billion by 1937. Railways carried 75 to 80% of interregional bulk commodities that underpin the Soviet economy, including metallurgy, chemicals, coal, oil, and construction materials. The Soviet railway system was utilized several times more intensively than railways in Western capitalist countries. High traffic volumes per kilometer of line resulted in chronic congestion problems. During the 1930s, these became so severe that factories were sometimes forced to slow production because goods couldn't be shipped. In 1935, the Central Committee ordered Lazar Kaganovich to solve the railway crisis. Kaganovich prioritized bottleneck areas over less traveled routes. He invested in heavy traffic lines first and left the least efficient areas to themselves. The massive industrialization efforts pushed by Soviet authorities placed enormous strain on the railways. Vyacheslav Molotov and Kaganovich admitted to the 18th Party Congress that industrialization was a heavy burden on rail transport. Even so, the Soviet government continued their industrialization efforts, determined to prepare for a future war with Germany. By 1939, the stage was set. Germany possessed a highly efficient, militarized railway system with standardized equipment and decades of operational experience. The Deutsche Reichsbahn could move massive formations quickly across the country. Poland sat in the middle with a railway network that connected east and west but suffered from the fundamental incompatibility between standard and broad gauge. The Soviet Union had built a massive but overtaxed railway system on broad gauge tracks, constantly fighting congestion as it struggled to support rapid industrialization. And the United States, despite Depression-era troubles, maintained the world's longest railway network. privately owned but capable of enormous capacity if fully mobilized. Military planners on all sides understood what was coming. Railway chiefs knew their systems would determine whether armies could be supplied, whether offensives could be sustained, whether retreats could be executed. The generals who had studied World War I understood that railways dictated the tempo of modern warfare. Mobilization schedules were built around train timetables. Offensive plans depended on calculations of how many divisions could be transported per day, how many tons of supplies could reach the front, how quickly reinforcements could arrive. The locomotives were maintained, the freight cars were ready, the tracks stretched across continents. Railway workers, engineers, dispatchers, and maintenance crews stood ready to perform the unglamorous but essential work that would keep armies moving. When the German panzers crossed into Poland on September 1, 1939, they would advance faster than the railways could follow. But within weeks, the railwaymen would arrive, converting captured tracks to German gauge, repairing damaged bridges, establishing supply lines. The war had begun, and the railways would decide its outcome. When Julius Dorpmüller became Reich Transport Minister in February 1937, he understood his role perfectly. The Deutsche Reichsbahn was no longer simply a transportation company. It was infrastructure for war. Dorpmüller, a railwayman to his core, had worked his way up through the ranks of the Prussian state railways. He knew trains, schedules, freight capacity, and locomotive maintenance. Now Hitler's regime wanted him to prepare the entire German railway system for a conflict that would dwarf anything Europe had seen. The reorganization began immediately. The DRG, the Deutsche Reichsbahngesellschaft, that had operated as a nominally independent company since 1924, was absorbed completely into the state apparatus. No more pretense of independence. The Reichsbahn Act of July 11, 1939, formalized what everyone already knew. The transport minister controlled the entire national railway by virtue of his office. Dorpmüller held both positions simultaneously. He commanded the largest public asset in Germany and one of the largest enterprises in the capitalist world. The Deutsche Reichsbahn employed millions. When you counted pensioners and employees' families, roughly 3 million people belonged to what they called the Reichsbahn family, about 5% of Germany's population. These weren't just workers, they lived in Reichsbahn-owned neighborhoods. They joined Reichsbahn leisure clubs. The railway was their identity, their livelihood, their entire social world. This massive organization operated with military precision even before the war began. The Reichsbahn headquarters sat at Vollstrasse 33 in Berlin, adjacent to the Reich Chancellery. As the 1930s progressed and the transport ministry expanded, it came to occupy buildings with facades on 3 streets: Vossstrasse, Leipzigerstrasse, and Wilhelmstrasse. In 1939, just before war broke out, construction began on a large air raid shelter with a 2.6-meter thick concrete ceiling under the ministry courtyard, connected to the bunker system under the new Reich Chancellery across the street. The railway chiefs were preparing for aerial bombardment even as they finalized invasion plans. When German forces crossed into Poland on September 1, 1939, the railway immediately shifted into wartime mode. Within weeks after Poland's defeat, the western portions of the country were annexed directly into the Reich. The railway infrastructure in these territories was integrated into the Deutsche Reichsbahn almost immediately. But southeastern Poland, organized into the general government under Hans Frank, presented different challenges. On October 26, 1939, the Germans established the General Direction der Ostbahn, known as GDOB or simply Ostbahn, as a separate entity from the Reichsbahn. This organization, headquartered in Warsaw, would manage railways in the general government. It operated financially and operationally separate from the Reichsbahn proper, though under German control. The invasion of France in 1940 exposed certain weaknesses. The rapid advance of motorized units outpaced the railway's ability to keep up. Sabotaged French railways had to be repaired quickly. But there weren't enough Eisenbahntruppen, the railway construction troops, to carry out the work fast enough. Frantic calls went out to requisition all the lorries of Germany to bridge the gap. But by the time they arrived, the French had already collapsed. Had France fought longer and more effectively, the Germans might have been forced to stop and consolidate. The split between their fast-moving armored spearheads and the slower infantry divisions relying on rail transport could have been exploited. These problems would become catastrophic in Russia. Operation Barbarossa, launched on June 22, 1941, represented the largest military operation in human history. More than 3.8 million Axis troops invaded along an 1,800-mile front. The Germans advanced on 3 axes: Army Group North toward Leningrad, Army Group Center toward Moscow, and Army Group South toward Kiev and the resources of Ukraine. The speed of the initial advance stunned everyone, including the Germans themselves. But the railway men understood what the generals apparently did not. The locomotives couldn't keep pace with the panzers. The fundamental problem was gauge. Soviet railways used a broad gauge of 1,520 millimeters. German and most European railways used standard gauge of 1,435 millimeters. That 85 millimeter difference meant German trains couldn't run on Soviet tracks. Every kilometer of railway had to be converted. The Eisenbahntruppen were sent forward as part of the advance party, sometimes even before the territory was properly secured, working under fire to relay tracks. This contradicted normal military practice, but the Germans had no choice. Without converted railways, their armies would starve. The logistics planning for Barbarossa had assumed supplies could reach 400 kilometers from the railheads, possibly 600, maybe 800 if everything went perfectly. 60-ton truck columns would bridge the gap between rail termini and the advancing armies. The German doctrine was clear, almost fatally optimistic. The logistical officer will not impede operations. Logistics men weren't even invited to planning meetings. They were handed operational plans and told to make it happen. By late July 1941, the new railheads were at various distances from the border in Soviet territory. When normal gauge lines were completed from Brest to Minsk, the Germans began taking the 60-ton truck columns off the frontier to Minsk route between July 20th and 30. The columns continued running from the border in decreasing numbers until finally stopping on August 5th. By then, rail lines extended beyond Minsk, and the Germans operated from railheads approaching Smolensk. But the armies were already far ahead of this. The scale of the railway operation was enormous. At the peak of operations, the Germans ran 230 trains daily just crossing into Soviet territory. On a typical day, 104 trains reached Kosodin, 64 reached Dnipropetrovsk, only 34 reached Stalino. Sufficient railway capacity existed 600 kilometers from the front line, but armies received only a trickle of supplies. By January 1, 1943, the Germans controlled 35,000 kilometers of track in occupied Soviet territories, all of which had to be converted to standard gauge. The chief for transportation had noted the shortage of locomotives and railcars even before Barbarossa began, back in January 1941. The operation would make a bad situation catastrophic. The Wehrmacht's motorized fleet was a ramshackle collection of 2,000 different vehicle types, largely purloined from occupied countries. These vehicles suffered enormous wear and tear on Soviet roads, which weren't really roads at all in many cases. Maps showed impressive road networks, but reality proved different. Dust roads in summer, sticky mud in autumn, snow and ice in winter. German tanks had narrow treads that provided little traction. The 600,000 Western European horses the Germans brought for supply and artillery movement couldn't cope with the conditions. An infantry division required 70 trains for full transport. A fully equipped panzer division needed up to 300 trains. The Germans simply didn't have the capacity to move the forces they needed where they needed them. By late 1941, skilled railwaymen had been drafted into combat units. The Reichsbahn struggled without experienced staff. Meanwhile, Soviet railways under the NKPS kept functioning despite massive disruptions. The Soviets evacuated entire factories and populations by rail, moving 1.5 million carloads eastward during the first months of the war. Soviet trains hauled even more than German ones, carrying up to 650 tons of cargo compared to Germany's 450 tons per train. The failure to capture Moscow in late 1941 came down to logistics more than any single battle. German forces reached the city's outskirts but couldn't sustain an attack. In mid-November, at the conference at Orsha near Smolensk, the Chief of Staff of German Army High Command met with front commanders. Every one of them argued against continuing offensive operations. Hitler and Halder insisted on pushing toward Moscow anyway. In early December, the Germans finally halted. One day later, the Soviets launched their counteroffensive. Operation Barbarossa, judged by its goals of achieving quick victory, had failed. And the railways were a major reason why. The chronic optimism that plagued German planning stemmed from underestimating the enemy and overestimating German capabilities. German intelligence, Fremde Heere Ost, had provided woefully inadequate information about the Red Army and Soviet infrastructure. Despite close cooperation between the German armed forces and Red Army from 1923 to 1933, when German officers trained in the Soviet Union, there's no evidence anyone systematically questioned these officers about what they'd seen. The Germans went into Russia blind. By November 1941, German casualties exceeded 740,000 men. All 400,000 trained reserves had been used up. there was still a shortage of 340,000 men even after using local volunteers for non-combat roles. Many of the casualties were experienced, well-trained combat troops replaced by inexperienced recruits. The survivors were exhausted, badly supplied, and facing the Russian winter without proper equipment. The railway couldn't deliver winter clothing, food, ammunition, or fuel in sufficient quantities. The locomotives themselves struggled in Arctic conditions. Boilers froze, moving parts seized, yet the railway kept running. Despite everything, despite the impossible distances and brutal conditions, the Reichsbahn continued operating trains into the Soviet Union throughout 1942, 1943, and into 1944. When partisan attacks intensified, German forces assigned at least half their troops in some regions just to railroad security. Polish resistance alone conducted around 2,850 railway sabotage operations between 1942 and 1945, attacking 1,825 large train complements, destroying 380 tracks, 150 bridges, and 210 stations. Yugoslav partisans made the Belgrade to Salonika line so dangerous that the Germans couldn't run their planned Orient Express service at all. The Germans cut down forests for hundreds of meters along tracks to deny cover to partisans. They built fortified posts at key points. They ran armored trains with anti-aircraft guns. Villages were relocated. Security operations tied down entire divisions that were desperately needed at the front. Richard Crampton estimated that resistance operations destroyed or delayed 1/8 of all German transports to the Eastern Front, causing severe supply shortages. The Reichsbahn kept pushing trains through anyway. At Stalingrad, the railway situation became critical. 3 railway lines ran into the city. The northwest line to Poverino and Moscow was cut by the German advance and unusable beyond Ilovlya. The lines to the west and south were German-controlled. On the east bank of the Volga, the Saratov-Urbach-Astrakhan line carried 19 train pairs daily with a front regulating station at Baskunchak, 140 kilometers from the city. A branch line to the Volga ferry port was completed in September 1942, but only carried 8 trains when demand was for 10. Stalingrad Front had just 2,500 lorries. Don Front had 3,600. Southwest Front had 3,197. Motor transport was desperately short. Everything depended on the railway. When the German 6th Army became encircled at Stalingrad in late 1942, they were 300 kilometers from the nearest functioning railhead. The Luftwaffe attempted aerial resupply, but couldn't deliver enough. The Army needed 700 tons of supplies per day. Air transport barely managed 100 tons on good days. The railway couldn't reach them. Without rail supply, the 6th Army starved and froze. By February 1943, over 90,000 German soldiers surrendered. It was the Wehrmacht's first major surrender, and it happened because the railway couldn't get there. But the Deutsche Reichsbahn's operations during the war cannot be discussed without confronting the darkest chapter of its history. The same railway organization that moved troops and supplies to the front also transported millions of Jews, Roma, and other victims to death camps. The Reichsbahn didn't just enable the Holocaust, it was indispensable to it. Without the efficient, bureaucratic machinery of the German railway system, the final solution could not have been implemented at the scale and speed the Nazis achieved. The deportations began even before the war. The Poland action in October 1938 saw the first mass deportation of Jews from Germany. After the invasion of Poland, deportations accelerated dramatically. By 1942, stationary gas chambers had been built at Treblinka, Belzec, Sobibor, Majdanek, and Auschwitz. The railways became the primary means of delivering victims to these killing centers. The bureaucracy involved multiple German government ministries. The Reich Security Main Office coordinated and directed the deportations. The Transport Ministry, Dorpmüller's domain, organized train schedules. The Foreign Office negotiated with German allied states about handing over their Jews. The system operated with the same efficiency and attention to detail as military logistics. Train schedules were maintained. Freight capacities were calculated. Costs were invoiced. The SS paid the Reichsbahn for transport charges. In 1942, the fare was 0.04 Reichsmark per adult per kilometer. Children paid half. Those younger than 4 traveled free. For groups of 400 or more, the Reichsbahn offered a 50% discount, the same group rate available to any large party. To save money, the SS crowded as many deportees as possible into each train. Typically 1,000 to 2,000 victims were packed into cattle wagons. In 1942, trains with up to 60 wagons became the norm, each transport carrying around 5,000 victims. Holocaust trains averaged 55 freight cars, loaded to 150 or 200% of designed capacity. The Germans used both freight and passenger cars. Jews from Germany and annexed territories sometimes went by passenger train, part of the deception about resettlement to the east. Jews from occupied Poland and the east were crammed into closed cattle wagons, 50 people per wagon initially, later 100, sometimes more. The doors were locked during transport. There was no food or water. A bucket served as the toilet. Another bucket held drinking water, often contaminated by the time the journey began. The stench was unbearable. Many died before reaching their destinations. The trains had low priority. They gave way to military transports, freight trains, regular passenger services. Deportation trains sometimes sat on sidings for days waiting for track space. In summer, people died from heat and thirst. In winter, they froze. Guards shot anyone attempting escape. The journey from Germany to eastern Poland typically took 50 hours or more, often much longer. Between May 15th and July 9th, 1944, during the deportation of Hungarian Jews, the Germans dispatched 147 trains carrying roughly 437,000 people to Auschwitz-Birkenau. That's nearly 3,000 people per train. Arriving daily at the death camp. The Höfle telegram, sent January 11, 1943, tallied arrivals at Operation Reinhard camps through December 31, 1942. 434,508 at Belzec, 1,001,370 at Sobibor, 713,555 at Treblinka, 24,733 at Majdanek. A total of 1,274,166 Jews transported primarily by rail. The victims were forced to pay for their own deportations. Jewish communities were charged for the costs of the trains. The Reichsbahn collected revenue for every person transported to death. According to expert reports, the Deutsche Reichsbahn took in approximately $664 million for mass deportations between 1938 and 1945. The 1942 statistical report lists nearly 3.8 million Reichsmarks under special trains for individual orderers. The railway profited from genocide. Thousands of German railway workers saw the deportation trains. Station workers watched as sealed cattle cars sat on platforms. Thirsty faces pressed against small air holes barricaded with barbed wire. The trains passed through towns and cities. Soldiers on leave, civilians traveling for business or pleasure, railway employees going about their daily work, all witnessed these transports. The knowledge was widespread, even if the full extent of the killing remained obscured. Most railway workers followed orders without question. Some acted out of fear. Some were indifferent. Some supported the regime ideologically. The bureaucratic nature of the organization, combined with Nazi authoritarianism, created an environment where complicity became routine. Railway officials planned schedules, maintained locomotives, collected fares, and processed paperwork with the same professionalism they applied to any other transport operation. The banality of evil, as it would later be called, operated at industrial scale through the Deutsche Reichsbahn. Albert Ganzenmüller, State Secretary in the Reich Transport Ministry from May 1942 to September 1943, coordinated deportation train scheduling. He assured SS Lieutenant General Karl Wolff that daily transports from Warsaw to Treblinka were operational. In 1973, a Munich court indicted Ganzenmüller for aiding and abetting murder in over 3 million cases. The trial collapsed on its first day when he suffered a heart attack and was ruled permanently unfit to stand trial. He lived another 23 years, but never faced justice. He was the only senior Reichsbahn official ever indicted for Holocaust transports, despite extensive documentation. Lower-level Reichsbahn employees faced almost no accountability. Train conductors, schedulers, station masters, track workers, all the thousands of people who made the deportations possible, returned to their lives after the war. Some faced brief questioning. Most simply went back to work. When Germany divided in 1949, the railway split with it. The Deutsche Bundesbahn in West Germany and the Deutsche Reichsbahn in East Germany both emerged from the same organization that had transported millions to their deaths. Neither addressed this legacy seriously for decades. The Deutsche Reichsbahn proved itself a devastatingly effective military logistics organization and simultaneously an instrument of industrial genocide. It moved armies across a continent, supplied front lines thousands of kilometers from Germany, converted tens of thousands of kilometers of foreign railway track, maintained operations under constant partisan attack and Allied bombing, and transported millions of victims to death camps with the same bureaucratic efficiency it applied to any other task. The railway was Hitler's most valuable asset. Without it, he could neither conquer Europe nor implement the final solution. The men who ran it knew this. They understood their role, and they kept the trains running. On the night of September 7, 1940, London's East End became a firestorm. Around 350 German bombers, escorted by over 600 fighters, dropped explosives across the docks, factories, warehouses, and railway lines that formed the economic backbone of Britain's capital. In just the first night, approximately 450 people died and 1,500 were injured. The Blitz had begun. For the next 57 consecutive nights, and often during daytime as well, German bombers returned to pummel London. The railway system, critical to Britain's war effort and civilian survival, took devastating hits. The Luftwaffe targeted railway infrastructure deliberately. Docks connected directly to rail lines. Freight yards sat adjacent to industrial areas. Station complexes served as hubs where people and goods converged. On that first night alone, fires raged across railway property. The weeks that followed brought systematic destruction. Birmingham, Britain's third most bombed city after London and Liverpool, suffered its first major raid in August 1940. Coventry, an important engineering and armament center, was raided on November 14 and 15, 1940 by 515 German bombers. They dropped 503 tons of high explosive and 30,000 incendiary bombs. The Germans coined a new verb for this level of destruction, Coventrieren, to coventrate. British railways kept running. During Birmingham raids in October 1940, incendiaries fell on railway property, starting fires in goods yards, but workers contained the damage quickly. When high explosives blocked the main line and the Coventry Loop at Humber Road Junction, buses substituted for trains until tracks could be cleared 2 days later. Railway workers arrived within hours of bombings to assess damage, clear debris, repair tracks, and restore service. The speed of these repairs was remarkable. Craters were filled, twisted rails replaced, damaged signals repaired, all while bombs continued falling elsewhere in the city. The government had anticipated aerial bombardment. On September 1, 1939, the day Germany invaded Poland, Britain implemented Operation Pied Piper, evacuating approximately 1.5 million civilians, overwhelmingly children, from urban centers to rural areas believed safer. Throughout Britain, 3,823 special trains carried 1,334,360 schoolchildren and some adults in the evacuation between September 1st and 4th, achieved over and above scheduled services. The four major railway companies, Great Western Railway, London Midland and Scottish Railway, London and Northeastern Railway, and Southern Railway, coordinated this massive movement with military precision. When war was declared on September 14, 1939, British Railways immediately transitioned to wartime operation. Control passed to the Railway Executive Committee, and for the first time, the term British Railways was officially sanctioned. The government took control but didn't nationalize. The railways remained technically under their private companies, but operated as a unified system directed by government priorities. Station names were blacked out to confuse potential invaders. A network-wide blackout was enforced. Wire mesh was fixed to train windows to limit damage from flying glass during bomb explosions. Timetables were radically altered to prioritize military traffic. The public faced constant reminders to limit travel. Posters asked, quote 1. People were urged to travel less, travel lighter, or stagger their journeys to keep freight and troop trains moving. The Railway Executive Committee used the extensive advertising hoardings and information posters at stations to hammer home messages about air raid protection, reduced services, and the imperative to avoid unnecessary travel. Business as usual became the defiant motto. Shop windows boarded up after bomb damage displayed the phrase in chalk, a symbol of British determination to carry on despite everything. The railway's most dramatic wartime challenge came in late May and early June 1940. After the German breakthrough at Sedan and the rapid collapse of French and Belgian defenses, the British Expeditionary Force and elements of the French First Army found themselves trapped at Dunkirk. Operation Dynamo, the evacuation, rescued more than 338,000 Allied troops between May 26 and June 4. The railway operation to move these men from southern ports to destinations across Britain was carried out effectively blind. Railway planners couldn't accurately gauge the number of troops arriving or the rate of landings at particular ports. The system remained flexible to respond as needed. On May 27, 1940, 186 trains of coaches from all railway companies were created and sent to the ports. They loaded with troops and were sent to reporting points to obtain directions to final destinations. A total of 620 trains moved more than 319,000 troops from their landing points to locations across the country. The railway achieved this while simultaneously moving government traffic and carrying out further evacuations of children. On June 6, 1940, troops evacuated from other parts of France to southwest England required another 200 trains. The entire operation was executed with such efficiency that most of the rescued soldiers reached their assigned units within days. Rail freight activity grew significantly throughout the war. In 1939 alone, British Railways moved more than 254 million tons of goods and more than 90 million parcels across Britain. This increased steadily as war production intensified and imports arrived at ports requiring distribution across the country. Coal, the fuel of British industry and homes, moved almost entirely by rail. Steel for shipyards and munitions factories traveled by freight train. Food imports arriving at Liverpool, Bristol, and other ports were distributed nationwide by rail. Agricultural products from rural areas reached cities by rail. Everything that kept Britain functioning and fighting moved on the railways. The workforce changed dramatically. At the beginning of World War II, only 635 women worked on British railways, mostly in domestic jobs like cleaning and waiting tables. By the end of the war in 1945, that number had increased to 10,899. Women stepped into roles previously considered exclusively male. They worked as porters, ticket collectors, and even locomotive cleaners. Some drove delivery vehicles, others worked in signal boxes and control centers. The sight of women in railway uniforms, once shocking, became commonplace. They worked dangerously long hours under constant threat of bombing, maintaining the same standards as their male colleagues. Preparing for D-Day placed unprecedented demands on British railways. The build-up for Operation Overlord, the invasion of Normandy, required transporting massive quantities of troops, vehicles, ammunition, fuel, and supplies to southern England. By 1944, over 2 million troops from more than 12 countries were in Britain preparing for the invasion. In the first half of 1944, approximately 9 million tons of supplies and equipment crossed the Atlantic from North America to Britain, all of which had to be moved by rail from ports to staging areas. Railway restaurant cars were withdrawn from service on April 5, 1944, to free up capacity. By the end of May 1944, 264,000 train miles were cut from timetables as tracks were cleared for Overlord. Passenger services were slashed. Freight movements not related to the invasion were delayed or canceled. Every available locomotive, every freight wagon, every meter of track capacity was dedicated to moving the invasion force into position. Overcrowding on remaining passenger services was severe. People jammed into compartments, stood in corridors, sat on luggage. The discomfort was accepted as necessary for victory. The preparations extended beyond simply moving material. Between February 9th and D-Day, Allied air forces, supported by heavy bombers, carried out attacks on 80 railway and road targets in France, Belgium, and Germany using 21,949 aircraft, dropping 76,200 tons of bombs. The transportation plan, developed to isolate the invasion beaches from German reinforcements, systematically destroyed French railway infrastructure. By D-Day, French rail traffic had fallen to 38% of February levels. The French National Railway was operating at only 10% capacity. Normandy had become, for all practical purposes, a strategic island. Across the Atlantic, American railroads faced their own transformation. The 1930s had been brutal for the industry. The Great Depression devastated traffic. Railroad passenger numbers, which peaked at roughly 1 billion in 1916, had fallen to 700 million by 1930. Major railroad systems entered receivership. The Rock Island filed for bankruptcy in 1933, the Milwaukee Road and Chicago and Northwestern in 1935. Revenue had plummeted. Investment in infrastructure dried up. The automobile and subsidized highway construction had stolen market share. By 1940, many observers believed American railroads were finished as a major transportation force. Then came the war. When the United States entered World War II after Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, American railroads suddenly became indispensable again. Highway transportation was restricted by shortages of gasoline and rubber. Coastwise water transportation was restricted by German submarine attacks in the Atlantic and the need for ships in overseas transport. Most domestic transportation had to be furnished by railroads. The statistics tell a remarkable story of industrial resurgence. In 1940, American steam railroads handled 378,343 million ton miles, about 62% of all freight. This nearly doubled by 1944 to 745,829 million ton miles, representing 70% of all freight transported in the United States. Some sources report the 1944 peak even higher, at 783 billion ton miles. Passenger miles increased at an even greater rate during the same period, from 23,816 million passenger miles in 1940 to 95,663 million passenger miles in 1944. In that peak war year, more than 75% of all commercial passengers traveled by rail, as did an astonishing 97% of military passengers. The railroads accomplished this with fewer resources than they'd had in World War I. When America entered the war, the industry had just over 41,000 locomotives and 2 million freight cars operating on under 230,000 route miles. This represented roughly 50% fewer locomotives, 33% fewer cars, and some 25,000 fewer miles than during the First World War. Yet they moved far more tonnage and passengers. The difference was technology and coordination. Heavier freight cars carried more per trip. Centralized traffic control improved efficiency. Better maintenance practices kept equipment running longer. And crucially, railroads avoided federal takeover by cooperating voluntarily through the Office of Defense Transportation. The railroads were desperate to avoid a repeat of World War I, when federal seizure led to chaos and financial losses. They cooperated eagerly with government coordination. The Office of Defense Transportation exercised general control over railroads and ensured national transportation priorities were met, but the railroads remained privately owned and operated. This arrangement worked. Operating ratios declined to a record low of 67.5%, while profits were so strong that railroads repaid $2 billion in debt during the war years. The Depression was over, at least temporarily. Freight yards that had sat half-empty for a decade were suddenly overwhelmed with traffic. From 1941 to June 1945, American railroads carried nearly 44 million servicemen and women. In the war's final years, the United States averaged 2,500 troop trains monthly. These weren't ordinary passenger trains. Troop trains stretched sometimes a mile long, packed with soldiers heading to embarkation ports on both coasts or to training camps across the country. The trains stopped at small-town stations where local volunteers provided coffee, sandwiches, and cigarettes. Soldiers hung out windows, waving at children who gathered trackside. For many young men, the troop train was their first journey far from home, the beginning of an experience that would take them across oceans to battlefields in Europe, North Africa, or the Pacific. Chicago became the nerve center of American rail operations. The Chicago and Northwestern's Proviso yards, initially opened in 1927, handled 15,000 freight cars daily during the war. Had this single facility faltered, American logistics would have faced catastrophe. Supplies from factories across the industrial Midwest converged on Chicago, were sorted, and dispatched to ports or military bases. The Proviso yards operated around the clock, 7 days a week. Railway workers understood that any delay, any bottleneck, could mean shortages at the front. The pressure was enormous, but they delivered. Wartime restrictions limited new diesel-electric locomotive construction, forcing railroads to continue buying steam locomotives. More than 4,000 locomotives were built for domestic use during the war. The year 1944 was distinguished by production of the last and best examples of several remarkable steam locomotive designs. The Union Pacific took delivery of its 4884 Big Boys, massive articulated locomotives capable of hauling heavy freight over mountain grades. The Santa Fe received 484 Northerns. Baltimore and Ohio got 2884 Yellowstones. Southern Pacific continued building its 4882 cab forwards. These were the technological zenith of piston-driven steam power, the final evolution of a 120-year-old technology pushed to its absolute limit. American railroad employees numbered approximately 1,400,000 by 1945, about two-thirds what it had been in the early 1920s. Yet they carried more freight and passengers than anything statistically established in the 1920s golden age. They worked longer hours, maintained equipment under difficult conditions, and dealt with the stress of knowing that delays could cost lives. Railway workers were exempt from the draft because their work was considered essential. But this came with expectations. Management and labor largely suspended disputes for the duration. Everyone understood the stakes. The challenge of moving military equipment overseas fell to specialized units. The military railway service, developed after lessons from World War I, was organized into grand divisions, each with 4 or 5 railway operating battalions and a railway shop battalion. Each battalion was sponsored by a Class I American railroad. When activated, railroad supervisors became battalion officers, and inducted employees reported to platoons relating to their railway specialty. Each battalion had 18 officers and 803 enlisted men divided into companies handling different specialties. Headquarters including dispatchers and signal management, track and signal maintenance, equipment maintenance including car and locomotive repairs, and train crews and train masters. During World War II, the military railway service operated and maintained railroads in Europe, North Africa, Iran, Asia, and the Pacific that totaled more than 22,000 miles, staffed by over 43,500 soldier railroaders. In Iran, they operated the Iranian State Railway, handling more than 4 million long tons of freight, plus special passenger trains carrying 16,000 Iranian military personnel, 14,000 Polish war refugees, 40,000 British troops, and 15,000 Russian ex-prisoners of war. During Muslim holy days from February 22 to April 21, 1944, they transported 21,000 pilgrims. The railway became a bridge connecting the Western Allies with the Soviet Union, moving Lend-Lease supplies northward. In North Africa, the military railway service deployed 5 operating battalions and 2 shop battalions after the Allied invasion in November 1942. The Axis had left North African railways in poor condition. Retreating forces destroyed equipment, sabotaged track, and removed rolling stock. When the 727th Railway Operating Battalion went ashore at Licata, Sicily, 3 days after the 10th of July, on ITA's 1943 landings, they organized national rail workers, located equipment, had steam up, and completed reconnaissance of rail lines 4 hours after landing. Within their first 24 hours, they were running trains. By June 1943, military railway service units in North Africa were moving about 90,000 tons of freight per week. At its peak, they operated 1,905 miles of railway. General Dwight Eisenhower, impressed with the work of the soldier railroaders, wrote that when the Allies went into North Africa, the railway could deliver a maximum of 900 tons of supplies. He credited Yankee energy and modern American methods of operation with increasing daily tonnage to 3,000 tons. In Italy, after Naples was captured, the rail yard there had been systematically destroyed by Allied bombing and German demolition. Technical Sergeant Louis Russell of the 713th Railway Operating Battalion described the scene as charred and twisted cars strewn around haphazardly with lengths of rail and cross ties still attached pointing toward the sky. It was a mess, but First Lieutenant Anderson, a yardmaster from Newton, Kansas, predicted they could get a train out by Sunday. Working around the clock with conductors, engineers, and firemen all pitching in to clear debris, they proved him right. A test train moved 4 miles out of the yard on Saturday. 4 days later, 6 trains moving an average of 450 tons each rolled to the forward railhead. With the rail yard operational, Naples became the primary port for supplying Fifth Army. From January through September 1944, an average of 136,567 tons of freight per month moved out of Naples by rail. After D-Day, military railway service units crossed to France. The Allies had begun ferrying railway equipment to England in 1942. By June 1944, some 900 steam locomotives and thousands of freight cars sat ready for shipment across the Channel. As Allied forces pushed inland from the Normandy beaches, railway battalions followed, assessing damage, repairing track, and establishing operations. 2 years of Allied bombing had destroyed railroad facilities across France. German demolition teams had completed the destruction as they retreated. Tracks were twisted into extraordinary shapes. Bridges were blown. Rolling stock was burned or hauled away. But the soldier railroaders were professionals. They surveyed damaged lines, prioritized repairs, and got trains moving with remarkable speed. By the end of December 1944, approximately 3,500 miles of single track and 5,000 miles of double track were repaired. 000 miles of double track lines were in operation in France. The railway system northeast of the Seine was in relatively good condition and had greater capacity than lines to the southwest. 2 transloading points were established around Paris, at Aubervilliers Station for First Army and Vincennes Station for Third Army, where trucks could transfer loads onto trains. Aubervilliers could accommodate 225 railroad cars and load 20 simultaneously. Vincennes could accommodate 400 and load 115 simultaneously. French civilians, 300 to 350 of them, worked in 3 8-hour shifts loading the trains daily. The liberation of France created new challenges. The French railway system, once excellent, had been devastated. Many of the lines were double-tracked for simultaneous bidirectional operations, and French rolling stock, while lighter and older than American equipment, had been well maintained before the war. The Germans had used French railways extensively during occupation to support their defenses. Allied bombing campaigns and French resistance sabotage had taken an enormous toll. Despite these attacks, German engineers proved adept at keeping critical lines open until the end. As the Allies pushed them out of western France, these same engineers destroyed what little remained. Only 50 serviceable French locomotives were captured southwest of the Seine. The Operation Overlord planners had anticipated this, estimating that Allied forces would require 2,724 large 280 locomotives and 680 smaller 060 types, of which 1,800 and 470 respectively would be for American use. By the end of June 1944, only 1,358 280s and 362 060s were on hand. Due to cutbacks in American locomotive production, the War Department couldn't guarantee delivery of the remaining 2,000 locomotives. They suggested obtaining 450 locomotives that had been loaned to the British. The shortage of rolling stock remained the most important limiting factor affecting railway operations in France throughout 1944 and into 1945. Allied success in Western Europe depended on logistics more than any single battle. The railways were the foundation of those logistics. British railways, despite devastating aerial bombardment, maintained service throughout the war and executed the massive D-Day buildup with precision. American railroads, written off as obsolete just years before, proved indispensable to victory, moving unprecedented volumes of freight and passengers with aging equipment and reduced workforce. The military railway service, staffed by professional railroaders in uniform, operated thousands of miles of railway across multiple theaters, keeping Allied armies supplied under the most difficult conditions imaginable. The trains kept rolling, and because they did, the Allies could fight. On June 24, 1941, 2 days after the German invasion began, the Council for Evacuation was created. Soviet officials understood immediately that the Western territories would be overrun. The speed of the German advance made any measured, careful evacuation impossible. There was no time for planning, no opportunity for coordination. Local Soviet organizations handled evacuations on their own initiative, literally hours ahead of advancing German forces. They scoured Moscow libraries for resources about evacuations during the First World War, because there were no actual plans for strategic industrial withdrawal into the eastern hinterlands. The scale of what followed remains staggering even today. From July through November 1941, the Soviets moved approximately 1.5 million carloads of freight eastward. In total, 2,593 industrial enterprises were evacuated, along with more than 12 million people, about 2.4 million livestock, significant food reserves, agricultural machinery, and objects of cultural value. More than 1,500 large factories of military importance were relocated to the Urals, Siberia, and Central Asia. From Moscow alone, 80,000 railway wagons transported machines and parts from almost 500 factories. The evacuations took place under conditions of complete chaos. Railway workers used every piece of rolling stock available, including outdated locomotives and wagons in poor technical condition. Trains were overloaded beyond any reasonable capacity. Nobody worried about maximum loads on the train depots. The motherland needed equipment hundreds of kilometers away from the advancing Nazis. The poor-quality steel Soviet rails were damaged by heavy trains moving on them. When machines couldn't be carried, they were supposed to be destroyed to prevent German capture, but explosives were scarce. Often there was no choice but to abandon equipment. In July 1941, 300,000 railway wagons were in operation for evacuation. In August, 185,000. In September, 140,000. In October, 175,000. In November, 123,000. The numbers fluctuated as German forces captured railway equipment, destroyed tracks, and bombed stations. From June to December 1941, the Luftwaffe flew about 6,000 air raids on frontline railway objects. The scale of disruption was enormous. Average daily railway shipments at the beginning of 1942 had fallen to 36,000 to 37,000 truckloads, about one-third of pre-war shipments. The human cost was severe. Millions of frightened civilians, both those with evacuation orders and those too scared to stay home, overwhelmed train stations and receiving areas throughout 1941 and 1942. After traveling in crowded cars with little food or water, evacuees often had to remain in railroad stations for days or even weeks, waiting for housing assignments or further travel instructions. Many became ill and died due to malnutrition and exposure. Sickness among the evacuees contributed to widespread epidemics that lasted for years. Historians debate the size of the wartime civilian evacuation for decades due to poor demographic records, with current estimates ranging from 17 to 25 million evacuees. The evacuation priorities were clear but brutal in their implementation. Defense workers and factories were evacuated with the highest priority. Industrial evacuees received larger food rations, higher quality housing, and better medical care. Non-industrial evacuees, mostly women, children, and the elderly, received inadequate resources throughout the duration of the war. The difference in treatment was stark. While factory workers were resettled and provided for, civilian refugees were often left to fend for themselves in unfamiliar regions with little support. But the evacuation succeeded. One Ukrainian factory was rebuilt in the Urals and delivered its first shipment of 25 tanks at the beginning of December, some 3 months after it had been evacuated. The Chelyabinsk-Kirov factory became home to the world's largest tank factory after evacuated equipment arrived. Workers laid railway tracks, reassembled 18 machine shops, and connected compressed air supplies. Starting with frozen ground, working round the clock, and living in tents, they achieved the task in 56 days. This feat was repeated hundreds of times across the Urals and Siberia. By 1942, despite tremendous loss of territory, the Soviet Union was outproducing Germany in tanks. The Soviets built 24,639 tanks in 1942, compared to Germany's 6,200. Factory 18 in Sverdlovsk built 15,000 Ilyushin fighter planes over the course of the war, dwarfing the production of Nazi Germany as a whole. In addition to the removal and reassembly of evacuated factories, the Soviets also built 3,500 factories from scratch from 1942 to 1946, which equates to 750 per year. Soviet industrial output, which had fallen catastrophically in late 1941, began growing again from March 1942. By 1943, gross industrial production increased by 17% compared with 1942. The railways made this possible. Soviet rail freight turnover, which had dropped dramatically in 1941, recovered and then grew. By 1942, Soviet economic daily car loadings represented 565,545 tons, equivalent to approximately 510 freight trains. Military loadings rose from 2,600 car loadings daily in 1940 to 12,100 in 1942, then to 13,500 in 1943 and 16,000 in 1944. 900 in 1944. This represented 28 to 30% of overall freight loadings. In broad terms, this was equivalent to 223,850 tons of military freight, or 373 military trains daily, not accounting for troop movements. The Soviets had larger railway capacity than the Germans overall and several multiples more in military traffic. On June 24, 1941, a military train schedule was introduced to ensure railway transport operation. At the end of 1942, 35 locomotive columns of the People's Commissariat of Railways Reserve were created. At the same time, over 3,000 kilometers of new railways were built. These measures significantly increased freight turnover, allowing faster relocation of forces and increased efficiency. The freight turnover increased by 1.5 times compared with the first quarter of 1942. The Soviet railway system used methods that differed significantly from German practices. Before the war, locomotive brigades usually drove trains in a particular area. In wartime, crew cars were attached to locomotives, and the crews led trains to their destinations. Train drivers drove trains thousands of miles away for months without returning home. In autumn 1941, the Soviets introduced the live lock system to increase capacity on certain railway sections. Every 800 to 900 meters on stages, signalmen were stationed and trains moved based on their signals. These improvised methods helped compensate for lost infrastructure and equipment. Soviet trains hauled more than German trains. A typical Soviet freight train carried up to 650 tons of cargo compared to Germany's 450 tons per train. This difference mattered enormously over millions of train movements. The Soviets concentrated limited supplies at points of decision, a policy they called central dispatch. Active fronts received priority over inactive ones. Within each front, active armies were supplied first. Within the army, supplies were directed to units that were successful in combat. This concentration of resources gave the Soviets seeming superiority of materiel at decisive points, even when overall production was comparable to German levels. But the most dramatic story of Soviet railways during the war belongs to Leningrad. On September 8, 1941, German forces captured Shlisselburg on the shores of Lake Ladoga, east of Leningrad, taking control of all land routes to the city. This followed the capture of Muga on August 29th, which cut the city off from the Soviet railway network. Leningrad, a city of 2.5 million people, was under siege. The Germans decided to bomb the city and starve its inhabitants rather than attempt to capture it. Food shortages began immediately. By November 20th, 1941, daily rations had been cut to 250 grams of bread for workers and 125 grams for children, the elderly, and the unemployed. That's 3 small slices of bread per day for most of the population. By the end of December 1941, 3,000 people were starving to death daily. The situation was catastrophic. German shelling and bombing killed 5,723 and wounded 20,507 civilians during the siege, but starvation killed far more. Estimates today suggest 800,000 people died in the siege, mostly from cold and hunger. The only lifeline was across Lake Ladoga. During warmer months, barges brought supplies across the water. When the lake froze in winter, trucks drove across the ice. This route became known as the Road of Life. On November 22, 1941, the first trucks crossed the ice carrying supplies to blockaded Leningrad. The first 60 went empty to check the ice thickness. The next carried flour and ammunition. The cabs were removed from the cars so drivers could work in the open air, ready to jump clear if the ice broke. It was freezing. The drivers worked under constant threat of German bombardment and the terrifying possibility that the ice would give way beneath them. The Road of Life was under constant fire from German positions, yet approximately 6,000 tons of cargo were transported round-trip along the route per day at its peak. Over the entire period of its operation, about 1.376 million people were evacuated and 1.615 million tons of cargo were transported via the Road of Life. More than 1.3 million people, primarily women and children, were evacuated from the besieged city through this route. The ice road operated under impossible conditions. Lake Ladoga measured 219 kilometers in length and 138 kilometers wide, one of Europe's largest lakes. The region's erratic winds were capable of increasing or decreasing the lake's water level by as much as 4 feet within just a few hours. Scientists calculated how quickly ice would form at different temperatures. At -5 degrees Celsius, 10 centimeters of ice would form in 64 hours. At -10 degrees, the same thickness in 34 hours. At -15 degrees, in 23 hours. A foot of ice, 30 centimeters, would be laid down in 24 days at -5 degrees. The route had to be maintained constantly. Engineers built wooden bridges spanning ice fissures, snow-compacted tracks reinforced with fascines, navigation beacons, and roadside depots for repairs and medical aid. The ice shifted and cracked. Vehicles risked becoming stuck in the snow or sinking through broken ice caused by constant German bombardments. But the road brought necessary military and food supplies in and took civilians and wounded soldiers out, allowing the city to continue resisting. During the winter of 1942 to 1943, the Road of Life achieved its highest levels of throughput. Operations commenced as ice thickened sufficiently in late November 1942, with truck convoys navigating a reinforced route approximately 30 kilometers long. The route facilitated the transport of 118,000 tons of food supplies, 55,000 tons of ammunition, and 33,000 tons of coal and fuel oil to the city, totaling around 206,000 tons of cargo. This represented a sustained effort to alleviate ongoing shortages despite harsh weather and enemy attacks. Evacuations that winter reached 88,000 individuals. Total seasonal evacuations exceeded 550,000 individuals by the ice's thaw on April 23, 1942. During 1942, the Soviets built the Artery of Life, a 29-kilometer-long oil pipeline via Lake Ladoga, of which 21 kilometers ran underwater at a depth of 12.5 meters. An attempted 35-kilometer railway on the ice-linking stations was also begun, but construction halted due to premature ice breakup in spring. The Ladoga military flotilla maintained deliveries during summer months when the lake was navigable. The siege continued for 872 days total. On January 12, 1943, Soviet troops of the Volkhov and Leningrad fronts launched Operation Iskra, aimed at breaking the encirclement. On January 18, 1943, they succeeded in opening a narrow land corridor south of Lake Ladoga. Railway and auto roads were laid across the resulting corridor during 17 days, and on February 7th, the first railway train arrived in Leningrad. This railway, laid on the narrow path conquered from German troops, was called the Road of Victory. It replaced the ice road for supply purposes, capable of delivering 2,000-ton daily hauls with minimal weather dependency. The partial lifting of the siege improved conditions but didn't end the bombardment. The city remained under at least partial siege and subject to air and artillery bombardment until January 27, 1944, when a Soviet offensive finally broke through German lines completely. Of Leningrad's 2.5 million inhabitants at the start of the siege, only 800,000 remained alive in the city when it was liberated. Around 1 million had been evacuated before and during the siege. The rest had died. Despite the blockade, over 200 enterprises continued to work in Leningrad, including 7 shipyards that built 13 submarines. Leningrad's industry produced 150 types of military products. Overall, during the siege, Leningrad enterprises produced about 10 million shells and mines, 12,000 mortars, 1,500 warplanes, and rolled out and repaired 2,000 tanks. The city maintained cultural life. Libraries remained open. Plays were performed and concerts were held. In August 1942, Dmitri Shostakovich's 7th Symphony was played by the Leningrad Philharmonic Orchestra. The concert was broadcast over loudspeakers pointed toward enemy lines in defiance of the Germans. As Soviet forces began liberating territories in 1943 and 1944, railway restoration became a massive priority. On May 26, 1943, the State Defense Committee made a resolution on restoring railways in liberated areas. By the end of the war, 50,000 kilometers of main railway lines, 2,500 stations, and sidings were restored. During the war, Soviet railroads restored 120,000 kilometers of railways, 13,000 small bridges, and about 3,000 large bridges. As the Soviet Union built 6,700 kilometers of new lines during the war years, construction continued even under fire. During the first 3 months of the Kursk campaign from March to July 1943, 3 major rail lines averaged about 2,800 cars with military cargo per day, reaching a daily peak of 3,249 in May. As Soviet forces regained territories, military and civilian railroad construction teams restored and rebuilt trackage destroyed by the retreating Germans. Special line of communications troops, including railway troops, bridge-building units, and engineer elements, grew in importance as organic components of operational rear services, critical to successful supply and support of advancing formations. Soviet partisans added to the railway chaos behind German lines. In August 1943 in Belarus alone, partisans carried out 21,300 rail attacks. According to German documents from September to November 1943, Soviets destroyed 20,505 rails. In 1944, Soviet partisans damaged or destroyed thousands of locomotives and wagons. Germans recorded over 400 partisan attacks in March 1943, with a peak of 1,100 in July. While Soviet reports are considered exaggerated, historians conclude that damage done to German communications was at times significant. When Soviet forces entered Eastern Europe, the rear services were given the task of managing and exploiting foreign road and rail networks. 11 strategic rear service transloading bases were deployed at junctions of railroads having broad Soviet gauge and narrower East European gauge lines, as well as at some seaports. The gauge difference that had plagued German operations now became a Soviet problem. But the Soviets had experience. They had been converting captured German tracks since 1941. They understood the work required. The proportion of young people under 25 years old in Soviet rail transport during the war accounted for 32% of the workforce. In locomotive service, it was 34.3%. In the car service, 39.3%. The number of women operating machinery rose dramatically. Women operating forging and press machines increased from 11% in 1941 to 50% by the end of 1942. These young workers and women kept the Soviet railway system functioning when experienced men were at the front. Railway workers faced extraordinary dangers. During the war, 16,000 locomotives were destroyed. Luftwaffe raids, partisan sabotage that hit both German and Soviet railways, artillery fire, accidents from overloaded trains on damaged tracks, all took their toll. Railway workers died maintaining tracks under fire, operating locomotives through combat zones, and repairing damage within hours of bombings. Their contribution was recognized. Railway workers helped provide training and conduct more than 50 strategic and offensive operations carried out by the Soviet armed forces during World War II. The Soviet railway achievement during the war was unprecedented. They evacuated millions of people and thousands of factories under fire. They maintained supply lines across thousands of kilometers while losing massive amounts of territory and equipment. They built new lines and restored destroyed ones simultaneously. They kept Leningrad alive through 872 days of siege using an ice road across a frozen lake. They converted their entire economy to war production and supplied advancing armies as they pushed the Germans back across Eastern Europe. The Soviet Union's victory depended on many factors, but none more fundamental than the railways. Without the successful evacuation of factories in 1941, Soviet industry could not have recovered. Without the road of life, Leningrad would have fallen or starved. Without restored railways following liberation, Soviet offensives could not have been sustained. The railway workers, operating in conditions of unimaginable hardship, kept the trains running. They moved armies, supplied fronts, evacuated populations, and transported the means of victory across a continent at war. The Soviet railway system, despite every disadvantage, proved more resilient and capable than the Germans had imagined possible. It was one of the decisive factors in the outcome of the Eastern Front. On the night of April 1, 1944, members of the French resistance near Ascq, a small town in northern France, planted explosives under railway tracks. A train carrying the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend approached. The bombs detonated. The train partially derailed. Several German troops were wounded. What happened next showed the brutal cost of resistance warfare. Waffen-SS personnel rounded up male residents of Ascq. They lined them up and executed 86 civilians in reprisal. The message was clear. Attacks on German railways would be met with massacres. This pattern repeated across occupied Europe. In Yugoslavia, partisan attacks on rail lines triggered the Kragujevac massacre on October 21, 1941, where German forces killed between 2,778 and 2,794 civilians, including schoolboys, as retaliation for 10 German deaths and 26 wounded from recent attacks involving transport disruptions. In Poland, intensified pacification drives after the 1943 surge in resistance actions resulted in the destruction of over 400 villages and execution of thousands. German security assessments noted temporary drops in local sabotage frequency immediately after operations, before attacks renewed and escalated. In Serbia, German authorities enforced a policy of executing 100 civilians for every German soldier killed by resistance forces, among the harshest reprisal ratios in Europe, resulting in tens of thousands of civilian deaths between 1941 and 1944. Yet the resistance continued. Railway sabotage became one of the most effective forms of irregular warfare against Nazi Germany. The Germans depended absolutely on railways to supply their far-flung occupation forces and to move troops between fronts. A destroyed bridge, a derailed train, a damaged locomotive, each represented a small victory that accumulated into strategic impact. Polish and Russian historiography called these campaigns the Battle for the Railways or the War of the Rails. These terms appeared in Polish historiography as early as 1975, initially describing operations by Polish and Soviet partisans in 1943, but later expanded to encompass all partisan operations directed against German-controlled railway infrastructure from 1939 to 1945. Poland occupied a unique and terrible position. After Germany and the Soviet Union divided the country in 1939, occupied Poland became a critical transit area connecting Germany to Soviet territories. Rail transport was the main method for moving resources supporting the German war effort. Following the end of organized Polish resistance in October 1939, Germans rebuilt damaged infrastructure and improved it beyond pre-war levels. They needed the railways functioning perfectly to support their eastern conquests. The Polish resistance faced a moral and strategic dilemma. Railway sabotage clearly disrupted the German war machine. But Poland viewed the Soviet Union, which had also invaded in 1939, as another enemy. Debates erupted within the Polish resistance, loyal to the government in exile, about whether aiding Soviet forces through railway attacks served Poland's best interests. The majority of Polish resistance affiliated with the government in exile and the Polish underground state decided to conduct only limited railway sabotage. They drew up plans for a wide-scale action codenamed Akcja Bariera, aimed at totally disrupting rail transport, but shelved it. The smaller communist-affiliated resistance rejected this restraint and supported extensive attacks on German supply lines. The first acts of railway sabotage on Polish territory occurred during the German invasion in September 1939 by Polish units tasked with operations behind enemy lines. These were few, and organized sabotage stopped after a few months as resistance organizations were just beginning to form. Many early acts in the first years of occupation came from individuals with little connection to organized resistance, often Polish railway workers employed by the German railways, the Reichsbahn and Ostbahn. Common acts included arson and damage to wagon traction or brakes. The first organized partisan attacks on railways occurred in 1940, averaging about once monthly. Such acts didn't become common until summer 1942. Then the tempo accelerated dramatically. In 1942, roughly 100 railway attacks occurred. In 1943, approximately 600. In the last 2 years of the war, over 2,000 attacks. By 1944, Polish resistance operations had intensified under Operation Tempest as Soviet advances neared. The Polish Home Army cut rails during local uprisings to trap retreating German forces. During the Warsaw Uprising from August 1st to October 2nd, 1944, urban fighters supplemented this by sabotaging nearby tracks and depots, though heavy street combat limited the scale. Between 1942 and 1945, Polish resistance conducted approximately 2,850 railway sabotage operations, including about 7% failed attempts. Successful attacks targeted 1,825 large train complements and 100 small ones. They damaged or destroyed 380 sections of track, 150 bridges, and 210 stations. Richard Crampton estimated in 1994 that 1/8 of all German transports to the Eastern Front were destroyed or substantially delayed due to Home Army operations. For the Germans, this represented a catastrophic drain on resources and a constant threat to their logistical networks. Ideological rivalry fragmented Polish efforts. The Communist Armia Ludowa, peaking at roughly 30,000 members, pursued parallel sabotage often aligned with Soviet directives, refusing coordination with the anti-communist Home Army, which numbered 400,000 strong. This mutual suspicion resulted in inefficient overlap and reduced overall impact on German rail resilience. Had the Polish resistance unified its efforts, the damage to German railways would have been even more severe. In France, railway workers formed the backbone of organized resistance against German rail operations. The Resistance Faire was established in 1943 by Jean-Guy Bernard, Louis Armand, and Jean Martelot, with help from SNCF director Albert Gerville and members of the Cohorts Astures and Émilie Plouvier groups. This movement consisted essentially of French railway workers from the SNCF and played an active role in the broader French resistance. After Jean-Guy Bernard's arrest in January 1944, Armand took charge under Jacques Chaban-Delmas's control. The Resistance Faire concentrated on three primary activities: reporting movements of German troops to Allied forces, sabotaging railway infrastructure and rolling stock, and conducting strikes and work slowdowns. Non-violent resistance such as strikes and go-slows proved remarkably effective, particularly by railway workers, in delaying movement of German troops and supplies. Between January and June 1943, resistance forces conducted 130 acts of sabotage against rail lines monthly. By 1944, this had escalated dramatically. Between April and May 1944, just before D-Day, French resistance destroyed 800 railway engines. Allied bombers destroyed another 2,400. The combination of bombing and sabotage made German transportation across France nearly impossible. Post-war analysis showed that the 150 most successful acts of sabotage against factories in France between 1943 and 1944 used just 3,000 pounds of explosives, equivalent to the bomb load of one single Mosquito plane. Resistance operations achieved strategic effects with minimal resources. For participating in resistance activities, 150 resistance Faire agents were shot and approximately 500 deported, with roughly half dying in deportation. On May 17, 1945, General Charles de Gaulle praised the group, stating that the railwaymen and women of the Resistance Faire fought regardless of risks during the entire occupation with persistence, courage, and discipline for France and freedom. Their activities were featured in René Clément's 1946 film La Bataille du Rail, which opened the first post-war Cannes Film Festival. The British Special Operations Executive, established in 1940 to coordinate subversive action against German forces in occupied countries, supplied resistance groups with weapons, sabotage materials, and other supplies. SOE developed an entire series of sabotage devices specifically for railway attacks. Testing at Longmoor, where the British Army maintained extensive sections of track and samples of rails from different European countries, was conducted in late December 1943 to determine proper quantities and positioning of explosive charges. These tests informed later operations. SOE's descriptive catalog of special devices and supplies detailed multiple methods for destroying railway tracks. One method used fog signal igniters placed ahead of explosive charges in the direction trains were expected. When the train's wheels ran over the fog signals, they detonated the charges positioned under the rails, derailing the locomotive and wrecking the train with minimal explosives. According to Boyce and Everett's book, SOE, The Scientific Secrets, as many as 48,000 railway charge kits were produced by SOE. The most ambitious coordinated railway sabotage campaign came in preparation for D-Day. In 1944, before the Normandy landings, Britain and the French resistance coordinated a series of actions known as Plan Vert. This plan targeted German telecommunications networks and railway infrastructure simultaneously. The French Central Intelligence and Action Bureau prepared the plan at the request of SOE. Resistance fighters blew up railway tracks and bridges to disrupt German supply lines and military movements. They infiltrated key facilities, planting hidden bombs timed to explode after their escape. The transportation plan represented the most systematic attempt to destroy an entire railway system through air power. The plan, devised by Professor Sally Zuckerman, an Oxford professor of zoology working as an advisor to the Air Ministry, called for destroying transportation infrastructure in occupied France during the preparatory period for Operation Overlord, so Germany would be unable to respond effectively to the invasion. Zuckerman was an unlikely architect of air power, described by contemporaries as a small, mysterious man in an unpressed tweed suit. Yet his plan would prove devastatingly effective. General Dwight Eisenhower's decision to implement the transportation plan was epic in its consequences. Except for Truman's resolve to strike Hiroshima, no World War II air war decision was more complex or caused more bitterness. Eisenhower had to halt U.S. and British bomber attacks on German strategic targets, divert these airplanes to strike railways and bridges in occupied but Allied France, and accept up to 160,000 potential French casualties in the process. He made this choice in spring 1944. Top Allied commanders debated fiercely. General Karl Spaatz, commanding the U.S. strategic air forces in Europe, argued for an oil plan, bombing German synthetic fuel production. He maintained that attacking rail yards and marshalling depots would not have a decisive effect within any measurable time frame. Air Marshal Arthur Harris, commanding RAF Bomber Command, didn't want to divert his bomber force away from their strategic campaign against German industry. But Eisenhower and his deputy, RAF Air Marshal Arthur Tedder, insisted rail targets had to come first. Eisenhower's reasoning was straightforward. Germans already had 12 panzer divisions in the West. The success of the whole invasion plan was conditioned on there being no more than 12, with only 3 near the landing areas. Air attacks beginning in April could reduce overall efficiency, canalize rail traffic, and strain the whole system. Delaying the arrival of even one division would be worthwhile. He conceded that some reduction in traffic, however small, would justify adopting the transportation plan. On March 6, 1944, Air Chief Marshal Charles Portal ordered attacks on marshalling yards at Trappes, Aulnoy, Le Mans, Amiens, Langeau, Courtrai, and Laon. Control of all air operations transferred to Eisenhower on April 14th at noon. The air campaign that followed was massive. Between February 9th and D-Day, Allied air forces carried out attacks on 80 railway and road targets in France, Belgium, and Germany, using 21,949 aircraft, dropping 76,200 tons of bombs. The Allies threw around 76,000 tons of bombs on French railroads, destroying more than 75% of the French railway network. By D-Day, French rail traffic had fallen to 38% of February levels. The French National Railway operated at only 10% capacity. Normandy had become, for all practical purposes, a strategic island. The statistics from individual raids show the scale of destruction. On the night of June 2nd to 3rd, 1944, Operation 41 targeted Trappes railway yards. A force of 128 aircraft consisting of 105 Halifaxes, 19 Lancasters, and 4 Mosquitoes from numbers 1, 4, and 8 groups attacked. Most bombing fell in the eastern half of the target area. 15 Halifaxes and 1 Lancaster were lost, representing 12.5% of the force. The Great Railway Belt around Paris that allowed military convoys to move from east to west toward Normandy was systematically interrupted by RAF airstrikes. The effectiveness was evident in German reports at the time. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, commanding Army Group B with orders from Hitler to push Allied invaders back into the sea, found himself unable to move reinforcements quickly enough. The transportation attacks only expanded after the invasion. Germany became the next target. Under Tedder's guidance, Allies attacked rail targets throughout fall 1944. Heavy attacks in the Ruhr in October 1944 slowed coal deliveries. Bombing rail marshalling yards became a tactically useful deployment of mass bomber formations when weather prohibited precision bombing of oil plants. The reality of daylight precision bombing was that most bombs fell somewhere near a specific designated target, such as a railway yard. The Air Forces designated as the target area a circle having a radius of 1,000 feet around the aiming point of attack. While accuracy improved during the war, studies showed that overall, only about 20% of bombs aimed at precision targets fell within this target area. In fall 1944, only 7% of all bombs dropped by the 8th Air Force hit within 1,000 feet of their aim point. Nevertheless, the sheer tonnage of explosives delivered was eventually sufficient to cause widespread damage. The U.S. Army Air Force dropped approximately 600 tons of bombs on German rail yards monthly from September 1944 to April 1945. Allied airmen dropped nearly 2.7 million tons of bombs throughout the war, flying 1,440,000 bomber sorties and 2,680,000 fighter sorties. More than 18,000 American and 22,000 British planes were lost or damaged beyond repair. As Tedder pointed out, Germans could build underground factories, but their lifelines remained on the surface. The more the Nazis dispersed production, the more they depended on rail and other lines of communication. Because of difficulties targeting railway installations without destroying adjacent towns, bombing was mainly confined to marshalling yards and major junctions, while resistance forces were charged with immobilizing French locomotive stock and destroying vital bridges. This division of tasks not only ensured thorough wrecking of the railway network but saved many urban areas, notably large swaths of central Paris surrounding stations, from damage. Instead, a few well-informed, brave railwaymen supplied with moderate quantities of explosives were able to paralyze rail traffic in the Paris area. The Germans greatly hampered by this destruction, which continued after D-Day, with resistance carefully targeting attacks to prevent reinforcements reaching Normandy. Consequently, when Allies landed in June 1944, there was effectively no railway system in France. A map of railways as they were on D-Day shows a series of short, isolated sections unable to support military movement over any distance. The 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich, stationed near Toulouse in southern France when the invasion began, took 17 days to reach Normandy, a journey that should have taken 3 days by rail. They were forced to drive the entire distance by road, suffering constant harassment from resistance fighters and Allied aircraft. In Greece, major railway sabotage incidents disrupted Axis supply lines. In November 1942, Greek resistance fighters demolished a chain of 3 viaducts on the Thessaloniki-Athens line. Later, they destroyed the Gorgopotamos viaduct during Operation Harling and the Asopos viaduct. These operations, though smaller in scale than French or Polish efforts, tied down German forces and disrupted logistics in the Balkans. In Norway, resistance fighters conducted the Tamshaven line sabotage among other notable attacks. Danish resistance proved particularly effective. Railway sabotage was described as very successful in Denmark, with coordinated attacks systematically disrupting German transportation throughout the occupation. Yugoslav partisans made the Belgrade to Salonika line so dangerous that Germans couldn't run their planned Orient Express service at all. The Germans cut down forests for hundreds of meters along tracks to deny cover to partisans. They built fortified posts at key points. They ran armored trains with anti-aircraft guns. Villages were relocated. Security operations tied down entire divisions desperately needed at fronts. Yet partisan attacks continued. Soviet partisans conducted railway warfare on an enormous scale behind German lines. In August 1943 in Belarus alone, partisans carried out 21,300 rail attacks. According to German documents, from September to November 1943, Soviets destroyed 20,505 rails. In 1944, Soviet partisans damaged or destroyed thousands of locomotives and wagons. Germans recorded over 400 partisan attacks in March 1943, peaking at 1,100 in July. While Soviet reports are considered exaggerated by historians, damage done to German communications was at times significant. Railway workers themselves became saboteurs. In addition to violent attacks by organized resistance, acts of rail-related sabotage included actions by workers such as causing minor accidents and delays, misdirecting and misrouting trains, and similar acts. Polish and Russian railway workers working for German railways caused simple delays, committed arson, and damaged wagon traction or brakes. These seemingly minor acts accumulated into major disruptions. The cumulative effect was devastating to German logistics. Railways were central to mechanized blitzkrieg tactics and sustained occupation. Directed by entities such as Britain's SOE and America's Office of Strategic Services, sabotage inflicted cumulative disruptions, forcing Germans to divert engineering resources and personnel from front lines. Though repairs typically occurred within hours to days due to practiced countermeasures, the constant need for repairs strained German resources to breaking point. Some scholars debate the ultimate strategic impact. German countermeasures, including fortified patrols and coerced local labor, maintained functionality despite persistent attacks. This aligns with analyses prioritizing German overextension and resource exhaustion over guerrilla-induced paralysis. No archival evidence indicates sabotage alone precipitated Operation Barbarossa's logistical breakdown or equivalent halts elsewhere. But combined with Allied bombing, partisan attacks created a synergy that made German logistics increasingly impossible. The human cost was immense on all sides. Resistance fighters lived under constant threat of capture, torture, and execution. Civilians paid terribly for resistance operations in their areas through German reprisals. German railway workers and soldiers assigned to protect rail lines faced constant danger from bombs and sabotage. Thousands died maintaining or attacking railway infrastructure. Yet the railway warfare achieved its purpose. By D-Day, the combination of strategic bombing and resistance sabotage had reduced French railways to isolated fragments incapable of supporting major troop movements. German reinforcements crawled toward Normandy at a fraction of the speed they needed. Throughout occupied Europe, partisan attacks forced Germans to divert enormous resources to railway security, resources that could have been used at the front. The unglamorous work of cutting rails, destroying bridges, and sabotaging locomotives proved as important to Allied victory as any major battle. The railways were a weapon, and the resistance learned how to wield it effectively. The final months of the war revealed the full extent of railway destruction across Europe. Germany's railway system, once the envy of the continent, lay in ruins. By late 1944, Allied bombing campaigns had systematically destroyed marshalling yards, bridges, and stations throughout Germany and occupied territories. The Wehrmacht's retreat from Eastern Europe saw German engineers demolishing whatever remained functional. The Soviets had lost over 65,000 kilometers of track during the fighting. Poland's railway infrastructure, caught between German occupation and Soviet liberation, was devastated. France's 26,000 miles of track had been reduced to isolated fragments incapable of supporting sustained operations. When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, Europe faced a transportation crisis unprecedented in scope. Approximately 40% of Germany's rail network lay unusable. Major rivers like the Rhine and Danube remained clogged with sunken vessels and destroyed bridges. Poland had lost 38% of its national wealth, much of it railway infrastructure. The Soviet Union counted 70,000 villages and 1,700 towns completely obliterated, along with the rail lines that had connected them. France saw nearly 2 million buildings damaged or destroyed, including countless railway stations, maintenance facilities, and worker housing. The scale of destruction defied comprehension, yet the foundations remained remarkably strong. Even in Germany and Italy, the two main targets of Allied strategic bombing, industrial fixed capital had grown by 20% and 30% respectively between 1936 and 1945. Power generating capacity had been enlarged and needed little repair. Industrial production had been brought to a halt not by the destruction of factories but by the demolition of transport infrastructure, particularly bridges and railways. The machinery existed. The locomotives, though damaged, could be repaired. The skilled workers survived. What Europe needed was reconstruction, not rebuilding from nothing. The human cost of railway operations during the war cannot be measured in statistics alone. Railway workers on all sides died maintaining tracks under fire, operating locomotives through combat zones, and repairing damage within hours of bombings. The Deutsche Reichsbahn lost 16,000 locomotives destroyed during the war. Soviet railway workers kept trains moving despite losing territory, equipment, and thousands of their colleagues. British railway workers endured the Blitz, maintaining service through 57 consecutive nights of bombing in London and countless raids elsewhere. American soldier railroaders operated in combat zones from North Africa to the Philippines, rebuilding destroyed infrastructure while under fire. The railways had determined the outcome of the war as surely as any battle. When Operation Barbarossa failed to capture Moscow in 1941, the failure stemmed from logistics more than tactics. German forces reached the city's outskirts but couldn't sustain an attack because their railway couldn't keep pace with their advance. The 85mm difference between Soviet broad gauge and German standard gauge became an insurmountable obstacle. Every kilometer of Soviet railway had to be converted by hand under fire, while armies hundreds of kilometers ahead starved for supplies. At Stalingrad, the German 6th Army became encircled 300 kilometers from the nearest functioning railhead. The Luftwaffe attempted aerial resupply but couldn't deliver the 700 tons daily the army needed. Without rail supply, over 90,000 German soldiers surrendered in February 1943, the Wehrmacht's first major defeat. The railway couldn't reach them, so they died. The Normandy invasion succeeded in part because the combination of Allied bombing and French resistance sabotage had reduced French railways to isolated fragments by D-Day. The 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich, stationed near Toulouse when the invasion began, took 17 days to reach Normandy, a journey that should have taken 3 days by rail. They drove the entire distance by road, suffering constant harassment. German reinforcements crawled toward the beaches at a fraction of the speed they needed. By the time significant forces arrived, the Allies had established their beachhead. The Soviet evacuation of industry in 1941 represented one of history's most remarkable logistical achievements. In just 5 months, from July through November, Soviet railways moved approximately 1.5 million carloads of freight eastward, relocating 2,593 industrial enterprises and more than 12 million people. Without this evacuation, Soviet industry could not have recovered. The Chelyabinsk-Kirov factory became home to the world's largest tank factory after evacuated equipment arrived. Starting with frozen ground, working round the clock, living in tents, workers reassembled 18 machine shops in 56 days. By 1942, the Soviets were outproducing Germany in tanks, building 24,639 compared to Germany's 6,200. The railways made this possible. American railroads, written off as obsolete in the late 1930s, proved indispensable to Allied victory. In 1940, American railroads handled 378 million ton-miles of freight. By 1944, this had nearly doubled to 746 million ton-miles, representing 70% of all freight transported in the United States. Passenger miles increased from 24 billion in 1940 to 96 billion in 1944. More than 75% of commercial passengers and 97% of military passengers traveled by rail in that peak war year. The railroads accomplished this with fewer locomotives and freight cars than they had possessed in World War I, through better technology, coordination, and operational practices. British railways, despite devastating aerial bombardment, maintained service throughout the war and executed the massive D-Day buildup with precision. In 1939 alone, British railways moved more than 254 million tons of goods. By 1944, railway restaurant cars had been withdrawn and 264,000 train miles cut from timetables to clear tracks for overload. Every available locomotive, freight wagon, and meter of track capacity was dedicated to moving the invasion force into position. The system handled the pressure. The military railway service, staffed by professional railroaders in uniform, operated more than 22,000 miles of railway across multiple theaters, with over 43,500 soldier railroaders keeping Allied armies supplied. In Iran, they handled more than 4 million long tons of freight on the Iranian State Railway, moving Lend-Lease supplies northward to the Soviet Union. In North Africa, they moved 90,000 tons of freight per week by June 1943, operating 1,905 miles of railway at peak. Between D-Day and VE Day, military railway service units loaded and moved more than 18 million tons of military freight in Western Europe. By June 7, 1945, American railroaders were operating 1,937 locomotives, 34,588 freight cars, and 25,150 miles of track. Polish resistance conducted approximately 2,850 railway sabotage operations between 1942 and 1945, attacking 1,825 large train complements and destroying 380 sections of track, 150 bridges, and 210 stations. Richard Crampton estimated that 1/8 of all German transports to the Eastern Front were destroyed or substantially delayed by these operations. In France, resistance destroyed 1,800 railway engines between April and May 1944 alone. Yugoslav partisans made the Belgrade to Salonika line so dangerous that Germans couldn't run regular service. Soviet partisans carried out 21,300 rail attacks in Belarus in August 1943 alone. The cumulative effect forced Germans to divert enormous resources to railway security, resources desperately needed at the front. The transportation plan, controversial but ultimately effective, saw Allied air forces carry out attacks on 80 railway and road targets in France, Belgium, and Germany, using 21,949 aircraft, dropping 76,200 tons of bombs between February and D-Day. By the invasion, French rail traffic had fallen to 38% of February levels. Normandy had become a strategic island, isolated from German reinforcements by the systematic destruction of its railway connections. The military that best employed its railways to transfer fresh troops and supplies to the point of greatest need usually prevailed. This principle, understood since the American Civil War, reached its ultimate expression in World War II, but the railway's role extended beyond military logistics. The Deutsche Reichsbahn transported millions of Jews, Roma, and other victims to death camps with the same bureaucratic efficiency it applied to military transport. Between 1938 and 1945, the Reichsbahn took in approximately $664 million for mass deportations. The SS paid 0.04 Reichsmark per adult per kilometer in 1942, with a 50% group discount for parties of 400 or more. Holocaust trains averaged 55 freight cars loaded to 150 or 200% of designed capacity. Between May 15th and July 9th, 1944, 147 trains carried roughly 437,000 Hungarian Jews to Auschwitz-Birkenau, nearly 3,000 people per train. The Höfle telegram documented 1,274,166 Jews transported to Operation Reinhard camps by the end of 1942. Thousands of German railway workers witnessed these deportation trains. The knowledge was widespread. Most followed orders without question, creating what would later be called the banality of evil operating at industrial scale. After the war, only one senior Reichsbahn official, Albert Ganzenmüller, was ever indicted for Holocaust transports, and his trial collapsed on its first day. Lower-level employees faced almost no accountability. The railway that had enabled the Holocaust simply continued operating under new governments. When the war ended, reconstruction began almost immediately. The devastation was enormous, but the need was urgent. An estimated 60 million people found themselves displaced across Europe, crowding refugee camps and makeshift shelters. European economies had collapsed. Currency systems failed. Black markets flourished. International trade ground to a halt. Yet European societies proved remarkably resilient, and international cooperation emerged as the path forward. The Marshall Plan, announced by U.S. Secretary of State George Marshall in June 1947, provided crucial assistance. Between 1948 and 1952, the United States allocated $13 billion, equivalent to approximately $140 billion in 2024 dollars, for reconstruction of affected countries in Western Europe. The plan distributed aid to 16 European nations. Transportation infrastructure, including railways, electric utilities, port facilities, roads, bridges, and airports, received significant funding. France received the largest share at 20.8%, followed by West Germany at 10.9% and Italy at 10.6%. The Marshall Plan's impact remains debated. By the time it took effect, Western Europe was already recovering. The funds provided accounted for less than 3% of the combined national incomes of recipient countries. Yet by 1952, economic growth in countries that had received funds had surpassed pre-war levels. The plan's true benefit may have been less the material assistance and more the political framework it created, establishing conditions for cooperation rather than competition among European nations. Railway reconstruction proceeded rapidly. The Soviet Union rebuilt its rail network with its broad gauge, reinforcing the separation between Eastern and Western European systems during the Cold War. Western European countries worked toward technical standardization and cross-border cooperation. In 1948, European countries created the International Union of Railways to coordinate rail development and set standards. These early efforts at technical cooperation laid the groundwork for today's integrated European rail network and eventually enabled high-speed rail. The reconstruction extended beyond simply repairing damage. New station designs emerged, offering improved passenger facilities and freight handling. Modern terminals in cities like Rotterdam and Hamburg set new standards. Railway electrification, which had begun before the war, accelerated afterward. Diesel locomotives gradually replaced steam. The technological advances developed during wartime, including better signaling systems and more efficient operations, carried over into peacetime railway management. The quarter-century following the war would be remembered as the most remarkable era of macroeconomic stability and social progress in Western history, the golden age of economic growth in Europe, both East and West. The foundations of this growth included reconstructed transportation networks that enabled trade, connected markets, and supported industrial development. Railways, rebuilt from the rubble of war, became arteries of prosperity rather than instruments of destruction. The lessons learned extended beyond Europe. When other conflicts erupted, military planners understood the critical importance of maintaining supply lines and protecting transportation infrastructure. The concept of interdiction, attacking enemy logistics rather than just enemy forces, became central to modern warfare. The railway's vulnerability to air attack, demonstrated so devastatingly in World War II, influenced military thinking for decades. In Germany, the divided railway system reflected the broader division of the nation. The Deutsche Bundesbahn in West Germany and the Deutsche Reichsbahn in East Germany both emerged from the same organization that had transported armies and victims during the war. Neither seriously addressed this legacy for decades. Only gradually, as generations passed and historical research accumulated, did Germany begin confronting the full extent of railway complicity in the Holocaust. The human stories of railway workers during the war deserve remembrance. Young Soviet railway workers, 32% under 25 years old, kept trains moving while experienced men fought at the front. Women operating forging and press machines increased from 11% of the workforce in 1941 to 50% by the end of 1942. British railway women increased from 635 in 1939 to 10,899 in 1945, stepping into roles previously considered exclusively male. These workers maintained the same standards as their male colleagues under constant threat of bombing and in the knowledge that delays could cost lives. American soldier railroaders, professional railroaders commissioned into the military railway service, brought their civilian expertise to war zones across the globe. They worked under fire, rebuilt destroyed infrastructure, and kept supply lines functioning under impossible conditions. When Technical Sergeant Louis Russell of the 713th Railway Operating Battalion saw the charred and twisted cars at Naples Rail Yard, he thought it hopeless. But First Lieutenant Anderson predicted they'd get a train out by Sunday. They did. 4 days later, 6 trains were moving an average of 450 tons each to the forward railhead. This pattern repeated across Europe, North Africa, and Asia. The French railway workers of the Resistance Faire risked everything. For their activities, 150 agents were shot and approximately 500 deported, roughly half dying in deportation. They sabotaged German operations, reported troop movements, conducted strikes and slowdowns. General Charles de Gaulle praised them in May 1945, stating they had fought regardless of risks during the entire occupation with persistence, courage, and discipline for France and freedom. Their story was featured in René Clément's film La Bataille du Rail, which opened the first post-war Cannes Film Festival. Polish railway workers, many employed by the German railways, committed acts of sabotage while maintaining their cover. They caused delays, misdirected trains, damaged equipment. These seemingly minor acts accumulated into major disruptions, yet they faced impossible moral dilemmas, knowing that aiding Soviet forces through railway attacks might serve one enemy against another. The Polish resistance's internal debates about railway sabotage reflected the complexity of occupied Europe, where simple narratives of resistance versus collaboration couldn't capture the reality. The railways had been decisive. Without the successful Soviet evacuation in 1941, Soviet industry could not have recovered to outproduce German industry. Without the road of life across frozen Lake Ladoga, Leningrad would have fallen or starved during its 872-day siege. Without American railways moving unprecedented volumes of freight and passengers, the arsenal of democracy couldn't have functioned. Without British railways executing the D-Day buildup, the invasion couldn't have proceeded. Without the military railway service rebuilding destroyed infrastructure, Allied advances would have stalled. Without resistant sabotage and Allied bombing destroying French railways, German reinforcements would have reached Normandy in time. The war proved that railways remained indispensable to modern warfare despite the development of motor transport and air power. Trucks and aircraft could supplement railways but couldn't replace them for moving the massive quantities of supplies that mechanized armies required. A single railway line could transport more tonnage than dozens of highways. German logistics failed on the Eastern Front not because railways were obsolete, but because the Germans couldn't convert Soviet railways fast enough to support their overextended offensives. Yet the war also revealed railways' vulnerabilities. Strategic bombing could destroy marshalling yards faster than they could be repaired. Partisan sabotage tied down enormous security forces. The gauge difference between Soviet and European railways created an obstacle that no amount of German engineering could fully overcome. Railways were powerful but fragile, capable of sustaining massive armies but vulnerable to systematic attack. The post-war world would see railways gradually decline in relative importance as highways, air transport, and pipelines emerged as alternative logistics systems. The interstate highway system in America, funded by the federal government, gave trucking the infrastructure advantage that railways had once held. Commercial aviation eliminated railways' passenger monopoly on long-distance travel. Containerization and intermodal transport changed freight patterns. By the 1960s, railways in many countries faced financial crisis as traffic shifted to subsidized competitors. But railways never disappeared. They evolved. High-speed rail in Japan, France, and elsewhere demonstrated that trains could compete with aircraft for medium-distance passenger transport. Freight railways, particularly in North America, consolidated into fewer but more efficient systems handling bulk commodities and intermodal containers. Urban rail transit expanded as cities sought alternatives to automobile congestion. Railway technology advanced with computerized signaling, electric and diesel-electric propulsion, and improved track engineering. The Second World War marked both the peak of railway dominance in warfare and the beginning of its decline. No subsequent conflict would see railways play such a central role in determining outcomes, yet the lessons remained relevant. Logistics still determines which armies can fight and which must retreat. Supply lines remain vulnerable to interdiction. Transportation infrastructure requires protection and maintenance. The unglamorous work of moving supplies matters as much as tactical brilliance. Today, more than 80 years after the war began, the railways rebuilt from its ruins carry millions of passengers and billions of tons of freight across Europe, Asia, and the Americas. The marshalling yards bombed in 1944 are modern intermodal terminals. The bridges blown up by retreating armies carry high-speed trains. The routes that once moved armies now connect economies. The railway workers who kept trains running under impossible conditions during the war left a legacy that extends beyond the conflict itself. They demonstrated that infrastructure matters, that logistics determines outcomes, that unglamorous work can be as heroic as combat, and that the people who maintain civilization's arteries deserve recognition. The trains that carried armies to war, supplies to fronts, refugees to safety, and victims to death camps are gone. The locomotives are in museums or scrapyards. The freight cars are long since replaced. But the rails remain, rebuilt and modernized, but following routes established generations ago. They carry a legacy of both triumph and tragedy, of logistical achievement and bureaucratic evil, of heroic workers and complicit officials. Understanding the role of railways in World War II means understanding how the modern world works, how infrastructure shapes history, and how the men and women who keep the trains running matter more than we usually acknowledge. That understanding, perhaps, is the ultimate legacy of the Railway War.